In this video, we will be looking at how to answer a question on Eric from an inspector calls. I've received so many emails recently and so many comments on my different videos asking, will I have all the videos on the characters ready for next week's exam? I'm talking to the 2025 cohort. Don't worry if you're listening in a different year. Yes, I will. I promise I'll have them all out. I'm going to work back to back. It's just a very busy time of year, so apologies, but they will all be out for the exam. So please bear with me. Even if it's the night before, I will get them all out. So let's have a look at Eric. Just a reminder, I tend to focus on Edexcel IGCSE examinations, but there is definitely crossover if you're here for AQA or Cambridge. This is still very, very relevant if you want to know Eric in great detail. The slight difference is for Edexcel, you don't have to talk about context, although context can be helpful, but we will not go into great detail I believe you'll need to for AQA, so just keep that in mind. So if you get a question on Eric, you should know these basic things about him, okay? He's the only son of Mr. and Mrs. Birling. That makes him the sole heir to Birling and Company. With that's going to come a lot of pressure, a lot of expectation. He has a strained relationship with his father. You could definitely argue he also has a strained relationship with his mother. He has a drinking problem. And why is he involved? Why does the inspector want to speak to him? Well, he had a sexual relationship with Eva Smith, and there are very serious questions that are raised surrounding the consent in that relationship and to what extent also he accepts responsibility for this. This makes him one of the most, I would argue actually, the most complicated character in this play, which actually means you've got great opportunity here to get really high marks when writing critically about him, because there's lots to explore and there's not really one secure way to look at him. He impregnates Eva Smith and he steals money from Birling and Company to offer her support. And he does feel remorse for the part he played in leading Eva Smith to society, and he is disgusted by his parents' unapologetic attitude. We come to question how remorseful is he, however, and we'll look at that a little later. He's a difficult one to say what he represents, because this actually depends. I think this is up for critical review. So it's kind of two sides, I would say. He represents the capitalist patriarchy, and it's almost like, look, this is the product of this system. Look at this young man in his early 20s. He's grown up in this capitalist society in a very privileged world, in this patriarchal system, and he is the product, and look at his behaviour. So I think that's one element. But he does offer hope, because he does show a capacity to change. We might question how much will he actually change, so we'll kind of come to that as well. Remember, I put this in every video. You can skip this if you've seen my other videos. This is a little reminder of JB Priestley and a bit about context. For Edexcel, you don't have to talk about context a huge amount, but you should know Priestley is a socialist, and he's written this play to undermine capitalism and to promote socialism. And this is a morality play with elements of melodrama. The original audience is in 1945. That's when the play was first played out on stage, and the play itself, the story, is set in 1912. So we have to think about, who is Priestley writing for? He's not writing for us, and I'll talk about that a little later with Eric. He's writing for a 1945 audience, okay? So what have they seen? They've seen the sinking of the Titanic. So they have been that kind of calls into question these industrialists, these people at the top of the hierarchy that you might argue society look towards. They must be the smartest people. They know what to do. Suddenly they send out this ship that was supposed to be unsinkable and sinks. So it kind of calls into question really the intelligence of these industrialists. Do they really know what's best? We have World War I and World War II. That completely changes society, okay? People are less willing to accept the hierarchy because people have sacrificed, the working class sacrificed their lives. People have lost their husbands and sons and brothers. They're not willing to go back to the way things were. That's the audience that are sitting there for those first productions. Okay, they're watching this really privileged family in 1912 saying, I am not accepting that, no way. Okay, or at least that's what Priestley wants them to think. We also have the suffragette movement. Women have fairly recently got the vote. Okay, so the way women are viewed in society is different. Okay, it's changing. It wasn't perfect by any means, but women, had to take on quote unquote male roles while the men went off to fight war. They don't want to go back home. They have a voice now. They want to be heard, and they potentially have more empathy for Eva Smith being obviously a female character. We also have the Great Slump, which is basically the Great Depression, and we have worker strikes. We have a lot of turmoil in society, and I guess you might argue Priestley sees this as an opportunity to reach out to this audience that have seen all these things and say, don't go back to the old ways. We need to massively reshape society and change the way that it's organised. And of course, what he's really doing is promoting socialism. Reminder again, I believe this is the same for AQA. For Edexcel, definitely you need to include language, form and structure in your analysis. So I use this key all the way through. If you see something highlighted in yellow, I'm talking about language. Blue, I'm talking about form. Green, I'm talking about structure. You do not have to have an equal number of analysis of each one, but you do need to have a good range. And to get those higher marks, you really want a diverse range, okay? So I would start with saying that Eric is an outcast in his family. He seems to be a bit of an outsider. We see that initially from those opening stage directions when he's described as not quite at ease. And that really juxtaposes with our expectations of how one should feel in sitting in a living room with their own family. That, of course, implies that maybe he doesn't have a very happy family life. The Birlings, Mr. and Mrs. Birling, have failed to create this warm, loving home life for their children, or at least for Eric. But it could also, so I think that's definitely part of it. And I think Priestley wanted to present the upper class as quite cold-hearted people, in the point that they even failed to create a warmth in their own homes. I do think there's another way of looking at this. Now we know, having watched or read the play, we know that he's got a girl pregnant that he's not married to, and she's not of his class. He's got a lot on his mind. So you could certainly say that actually him being not quite at ease is his anxiety over all of that as well. And of course, what we also know later on is Mrs. Birling in particular is outraged by his behaviour. Mr. Birling is not happy either. And so, this is not a family, or these aren't parents he can go to. So again, all of that suggests, he's got to kind of keep it all inside of him and keep it to himself. It encourages him to be secretive. He is the only character that is described as downstage. Everyone else is upstage. Again, that kind of just physically symbolises him as an outsider in his own family, and it foreshadows actually the way his parents will single him out at the end of the play. They point to him basically at the end and say, you're the one I blame for this. Mr. Birling said that, and Mrs. Birling says, Eric, I'm absolutely ashamed of you. The direct address from both of them in their dialogue attributes sole blame to Eric. And of course, what they're really doing is using him as a scapegoat, because they're unwilling to accept any responsibility, and they want to place all of it on Eric. There is definitely argument that Eric did the worst thing and that more blame should be placed on him, but the whole point of this play, the whole point of the inspector being there, is to say you all have to take shared responsibility. Okay, no one is off the hook here. And of course they don't get that. Looking at the language in Mrs. Birling's quote, the adverb absolutely intensifies this sense of disgust in her own son. The verb ashamed creates that real judgmental tone, and both of them are very condemnatory, which just basically means they're being very judgmental. Okay, and that could explain Eric's secretive nature. His parents have not created that safe place for him to grow up in. He doesn't have the type of parents you can go to, and he says this himself to his father. You are not the kind of father a chap could go to when he's in trouble. And he says to his mother, You don't understand anything. You never did. You never even tried. So it gives you an insight into the type of upbringing he has had. And of course, Priestley is doing this, like I said, to create this sense that, isn't it horrible to, like, aren't the upper class just awful? Why would we even want to keep this system? They're so cold-hearted. We do also see him being undermined by his parents. With Mr. Birling, he just speaks over him at the beginning. He doesn't really let Eric voice his opinion. There's Eric saying, but still, he wants to talk about the war, and he just says, let me finish, Eric. So at the beginning, what we see is that it's really difficult for Eric to voice his own opinions. That incomplete sentence is created because Mr. Birling is interrupting him. And it's ironic because actually Eric is trying to raise a valid point about the war, and the audience, of course, of 1945 know that he's onto something. Like, Mr. Birling, shut up, listen to your son, he's got a good point there. You don't realise you're going to have two wars, in fact. And that imperative, let me finish, okay, creates a commanding tone that overpowers Eric and makes it really difficult for him to be heard at this point. And again, it gives us an insight into his upbringing, where he hasn't been listened to. He's been, his ideas have been undermined, and it's encouraged him to be very immature, which we'll see on the next slide. His mother, on the other hand, sees him as only a boy. That infantilizing language with the word boy undermines him. And you could argue it's why he's so immature and irresponsible, because his parents haven't created an environment for him to behave any other way than being a boy. He's not listened to, his opinions aren't taken seriously, and he's literally referred to as a boy. Alternatively, again, thinking about that critical analysis to get those top marks, you might read this actually as an indication that Eric's really deceptive and he's kind of got his mother fooled, right? That she sees him as sweet and innocent, and he's really played the part at home. She has no idea what he really is like. So, of course, that's one way to look at it. And this leads perfectly to the fact that he is incredibly immature, okay? Keep in mind, he's supposed to be in his 20s, okay? Compare him to the life that Eva Smith has led. So we see this in many ways. One way is in those opening stage directions that describe him as half shy and half assertive, which is a juxtaposition, it's a contradiction. And I think that reflects his internal conflict. He doesn't really know who he is, which you might argue is normal for a 20-odd-year-old. He's still trying to figure out who he is. And I think really also, that really reflects the contradictory nature of his character that I struggle with as an audience member. I struggle to fully grasp who he is and to summarize him easily. And again, that's what makes him a really great character to write about, because there's lots to explore and there's lots to be critical about. It does suggest that he's not quite sure who he is, and he struggles to navigate social situations, even with his family, with self-assuredness. He's not there, okay? He doesn't have much confidence, much sense of who he is. The immaturity is also seen by Gerald, right? When the inspector comes, he says, oh, I hope, Eric's not been up to something. And that joke really implies that out of the family, Eric is the liability. And that would suggest that there's been previous behaviour that would make it most likely that the inspector would be here. Of course, this is ironic, because actually, even though Gerald says this in jest, Eric is the only character who has committed a crime. We'll come back to this. The crime I'm talking about is him stealing from his company. Of course, it could be argued from a modern perspective that he's also, his other crime is rape. But that's complicated because in 1912, unfortunately, I don't think the legal system was there, and we'll talk about this a bit more, for him to have been found guilty of that. But he certainly has stolen from his father's company. And then when it's revealed that he's been stealing money from his father's company, and his mother says, "You've stolen?" He says, "No, not really. I intended to pay it back." That just really highlights how immature he is. He's so naive. He's short-sighted. He thinks he can help Eva, give her money, provide for his unborn child and the woman that's carrying his child. And he hasn't really thought ahead. Well, how the hell is he going to pay this back? So his negation, right? No is the negation. He's disagreeing, is concerning. He doesn't actually realize that he's stealing, or he does, and he just won't take accountability. And what it is really, he's attempting to diminish the severity of his crime. So again, he's not mature enough to accept full responsibility. And this is the issue that we should have with Eric, because in some instances, he shows this great sense of morality, and in many other instances, he does actually fail to take accountability for his own actions. I would argue he is deep down very unhappy. I've put lots of quotes there. You definitely don't need to use all of these, but there are repeated references to his alcoholism. His sister points out that he's squiffy, which basically means that he's a bit tipsy. It's mentioned that he's been steadily drinking too much for the last 2 years. Before he's interrogated, he asks miserably, "Could I have a drink first?" He doesn't remember his sexual intercourse with with Eva Smith, or at least he says he doesn't. And when he takes his drink, what's concerning is how familiar he seems with a quick, heavy drink. So those repeated references clearly indicate that he's got a dependency on alcohol. And I would argue this is probably a result of him feeling this kind of discomfort in himself, the anxiety he feels around his family. But I think the stage direction, if I was going to use any of those quotes, I'd probably go for the one where the stage direction says that he's also speaking miserably, because I do think that suggests that he's deeply unhappy, and what he's doing really is turning to drink to alleviate him from his inner turmoil. I think what Priestley does here is he highlights that even the most privileged can be victims of a society based on capital gains. He obviously leads a very wonderful life in many respects, but he's not happy. So like Priestley's even trying to say, look, even the most privileged aren't actually that happy. And we're going to come back to this, but this does make Eric a very complicated character, because he is drunk on stage and he only gets more drunk, okay? So when we look at his convictions, it's really difficult to fully interpret what he's saying and what he truly believes. Does he grow more confident in his ideas, or actually is it just Dutch courage because he's actually just drunk? He is definitely exploitative, and I think this is the most complicated part of Eric. Look what he says about his interaction with with Eva. Why do I keep saying Sheila? Please don't make that mistake in the exam. I'm not very clear about it, but afterwards she told me that I was in that state when a chap easily turns nasty. Oh my God, how stupid it all is. So first of all, let's talk about how he shows some remorse. Okay, he does. He uses exclamations, dashes, blasphemous language in that final sentence to show that, he does feel some type of remorse, some type of guilt for what he's done. However, it's definite, and I encourage you to argue he does not take full responsibility. Look at the ambiguous language. He says, I'm not very clear about it. Afterwards, what are you talking about? What's it? What did you do? After what? Okay. He does not ever directly say what he did. And then he uses third person. Instead of saying I was in that state when I could easily turn nasty, he says a chap. So that use of third person distances himself from his actions. And the noun chap, ironically, also has connotations of friendliness. So he's kind of downplaying also his actions. I think what's most distressing is the euphemism used in nasty, okay? Because what he's saying here is that he was threatening, that he was coercive. And what that really reflects, by using that euphemism, by softening what he did, he's reflecting a normalization of male violence against women. And even though he's not saying he was literally violent, he's saying he threatened that violence, and that's why she let him in, and that's why she let him have sex with her. And of course, that collectivization, he's, saying this is, all chaps, that state that all chaps get into, when they turn nasty. That collectivization of his actions reflects the conventions of upper class society. He's saying this is normal behavior for men like him. Now, I know lots and lots of people will go straight to the point of, well, this is clearly rape. And by modern standards, we should be absolutely disgusted by his actions and come to the conclusion that this is most likely rape. He's talking about, or he's hinting at, coercive behavior, and he says she didn't want him to come into her place, right? So he's kind of forced himself on her. Where I'm careful is thinking about when this was written. In 1912, I'm not going to go into this in great detail because this is Edexcel, and they don't want you to talk about context in great detail. But what you should know, in 1912, there were many things that were in place to make it difficult for a woman to claim that she was raped. They would look at it, there had to be a physical struggle. So you couldn't just threaten violence, you had to be violent. It would depend on your relationship. They'd be definitely question, why were you at that bar? Surely if you're at that bar, you're a prostitute. And also they would look at the chastity of the victim. In other words, have they had sex before? So we know that Eva Smith has had sex before with Gerald, and therefore it's highly unlikely that in 1912 this would have been seen as rape. So what that does tell us is even the inspector on stage wouldn't have potentially seen this as rape. And then think about the 1945 audience. That's a little bit complicated because we do have the suffragette movement. We do have a change in mindset amongst women. But I would still say, you know, this would also still be seen complicated. You might even say today this would be difficult. It is difficult today to get a conviction of rape. So 1945, I don't even know if the audience then would respond to this and think, well, this was rape. But what I think Priestley at least was saying was that this was exploitative. He certainly is not saying this behaviour is good, but I think he would go as far as to say this was exploitative, that he was taking this girl, he was forcing himself on her for sure, but I don't know if he would have used that language. Of course, if you are going to use that language in your essay, I think what would be helpful is if you were to say the modern audience would interpret it as this. And I think that's very, very valid and very important that you take that away from the play. But I just think be careful when you're talking about Priestley's intentions, not to give him the values and the norms that we have in society today, that he potentially didn't have in 1945. Anyway, the point is he was definitely exploitative. And look at the way he speaks first. She wasn't the usual sort, but well, I suppose she didn't know what to do. So the noun sort objectifies her, it categorises her as a prostitute, and it creates this really judgmental tone. And the adjective usual implies that Eric has frequently slept with prostitutes. And again, that reflects the normalisation of upper class men paying working class women for sex. The fact that she didn't know what to do also, I think, so important that that was included in the dialogue, because that really stresses that Eva's very innocent and she's very vulnerable, and Eric sees this as an opportunity to exploit her for sexual gratification. I've put this quote here because I just think it highlights the hypocrisy of the upper class, which is what Priestley wanted to do. Earlier in the play, Gerald says we're respectable citizens and not criminals. And what really is happening here is that he's exploring the hypocrisy of the upper class. Okay, Eric is growing up in a world with the likes of Alderman Megarty, who we know has been called a womanizer, that teared a girl's shirt. Gerald, we know, exploits Sheila. Mr. Birling downplays Gerald's behaviour, you know, having an affair basically the summer before, and tries to excuse it. He also downplays his treatment of working class women who he recruits. So they are Eric's role models in the world that he lives, and they've all displayed a complete disregard for working class women as anything other than objects for their own gain. So he's in a world where he just sees men exploit working class women. So I think what Priestley mostly wanted to highlight is the hypocrisy of these men calling themselves respectable citizens, then exploiting these women in the way that they do. However, I've said all these things about Eric, but he does show compassion. When he hears about this girl that has committed suicide, obviously he doesn't know that he has this relationship with her at this point, but he involuntarily shouts, "My God." So the stage direction, I forgot to highlight this, sorry, stage direction would be in blue, indicates an authentic response from Eric. He is capable of compassion. He understands the tragedy that a girl committing suicide is. This is intensified by the exclamation. That should be highlighted in green. This is structure. as well as the blasphemous language, because he's saying my God, so that would be in yellow. And that would be somewhat frowned upon to say my God in 1912. But it does show he has a real reaction to it. It's involuntarily, sorry. So it's not contrived, it's not putting it on for show. He genuinely responded in that way. And, we see him be judgmental of his father. He could have kept her on instead of throwing her out. Why shouldn't they try for higher wages? We try for the highest possible prices. He has a judgmental tone when speaking about his father's actions. That does indicate he's capable of independent thinking. It foreshadows how he will not blindly agree with his parents by the end of the play. Foreshadows should be in green. He uses logos, in other words, he uses reason. In his argument. Why shouldn't they try for high wages? We try for the highest possible prices. So he's a critical thinker, and that's something that Priestley encourages in the audience, and he believes that's essential to create change, to think differently, not just to follow those before you. He says to his mother, you killed her, and the child she'd have, my child, your own grandchild, you killed them both, damn you, damn you. So those fragmented sentences reflect Eric's distress. He's directly addressing his mother by saying you, so he's focusing all the blame on her in this moment. And I think all he's doing there is really, it's just a real emotional response. He realizes the gravity of her actions, much more than she does. He uses blunt, violent language to try and reiterate, to highlight to his mother the severity of harm that she has caused. But of course, this is ironic, right? Because he can consider the ambiguous language he used for himself to avoid saying what he did to Eva, and then he's incredibly direct with his own mother. So he's much more comfortable directing that blame in this moment than he is talking about the part that he played. By the end of the play, he's shouting, we all helped to kill her. So he increasingly becomes more animated over the course of the play, as we see in the stage directions. So we see some parallels here with him and his sister Sheila, in terms of their body language. They're definitely extremely distressed at this point, distressed by their family, distressed by the fact that their parents won't take any responsibility, and that collective language as well, we, shows that he gets the point that the inspector was trying to make. We are responsible. So he is a dynamic character, but he's not so clear-cut as his sister. He's a dynamic character to a point, I would argue. One thing is to say, you could mention the inspector and what he says about the younger generation. He says they are more impressionable. He's saying this about he's talking about Sheila really, but in general he's talking about younger people, and he sees this as a positive quality in them. So he sees in Sheila and Eric an ability to be more receptive to a new way of thinking. Unlike their parents, they have a capacity to change. And we do see this to a point in Eric, right? He starts half shy, half assertive. By the end, he's very assertive. He's cutting in, he's shouting, okay? So there is a sense of conviction in what he's saying. And then we also see parallels. Sorry, this should be in green. I don't know why my highlighting suddenly stopped. Parallels should be in green between what he says and the inspector. He says the money's not the important thing, it's what happened to the girl and what we did to her that matters. And that really echoes what the inspector was trying to instill in them. We are members of one body, we are responsible for each other. But it's so important to remember he is drunk. So how much can we really conclude about Eric while he is under the influence of alcohol? And you don't necessarily have to have an answer. You may, and that's fine, you need to support that. But you could almost leave it open-ended, right? We don't fully trust that he has changed, unlike Sheila. We have great faith that she's changed. She's going to go forth and make great change. We're not so certain about Eric. So what's the overall message that we can take through the character of Eric? One, hope does lie with the younger generation. He and Sheila are the only characters who really show change, and they are the youngest characters on stage. And I think certainly there's a big, strong message there from Priestley to the younger generation. One must be willing to reject societal norms and values to affect change. And the question here is, do we think Eric can do this? We know Sheila can. We're not so certain about Eric. He has shown a sense of morality, a moral compass. He knows what's right and wrong, but he wasn't that comfortable accepting responsibility. He kind of dodged things. He said things indirectly, and sometimes he completely downplayed things. So I'm not wholly comfortable that he's going to go forth and make change. But the reality is he's going to go to World War I and die. Unfortunately, that's probably what's going to happen to him. But anyway, but I think overall, there's this point in we must all acknowledge our mutual responsibility to each other. Eric does that. He acknowledges that we are all responsible, we're all part of community. But the question for Eric must be, do we actually think he'll act upon it? And I'm not sure. I'd love to know what you think. Please leave a comment in the comment section. And if you have any other questions or you want to reach out to me directly, you can catch me at mrsrumsey@mrsrumsey.com.